Welcome to the ISO Show, dispelling myths and sharing tips for success to improve your business with ISO standards, with your host, Mel Blackmore.
Hi and welcome to the ISO Show. My name is Mel Blackmore. I'm the CEO and founder of Blackmores and Carbonology, and I'm delighted to have a really interesting guest on today who's going to be talking about their journey in relation to B Corp, which is a topic that we're covering this month as part of the B Corp Awareness Month. So my guest today is Laura Elms, and she's Forest's Vice President of Sustainability and Communications. And she's taking the lead on the organisation's communications, public policy and sustainability strategy. So Forest, for those of you that aren't aware, is the only shared e-bike operator to power its entire fleet, including service vehicles, with renewables from the outset, which is really impressive. And it's one of the world's first micro-mobility companies to have B Corp accreditation. And it's the only micro-mobility company to have achieved VERA validation. So without further ado, welcome, Laura.
Hi there. Thank you, Mel. Thank you for having me on your podcast.
Great. Yeah, no, thank you for joining me. So before we begin, would you mind just providing a little bit of background in terms of your role and how you got involved with sustainability?
Yeah, so I've had a bit of a sort of non-linear approach to getting into the sustainability world. I started out my career after I graduated in financial communications and investor relations at a firm, and actually it was a woman that I worked very closely with there who went on to found Forest along with two other co-founders. So we worked together closely in the more kind of corporate world, if you like. And then I left after a couple of years and went into the startup world, which really sort of started my appetite for that space in an American tech company. So when her name is Caroline reached out to me, who I'd worked with at Finsbury before, to start Forest, I thought it's a no-brainer. I've always been interested in sustainability and I loved that startup space. So that's how I got into it. And then I covered a lot of areas within the business from the outset because there were only four of us. So you sort of do that, you get stuck in across the board. And sustainability was always the thing that I was sort of most drawn to, most passionate about. So it's now been 6 years of us being on this journey together, and sustainability has really been sort of the baby that I've led on from the outset.
Great. I mean, a lot of organisations talk about sustainability, but most of them are making pledges about sustainability, and not that many actually go through certification. I know that on the ISO show here, we often talk about ISO 14001 and other ISO standards, but I'm keen to dive into B Corp because I think it's a phenomenal, not just a standard and framework, but a movement, which I really respect. So yeah, I'd just like to dive into, what was kind of the important aspect of B Corp to Forest, that got you involved with it from the beginning?
Yeah, it's a good question. So from the beginning, I kind of recognised B Corp. It was gaining a bit of traction when we started in 2020. So around 2018, 2019, you saw a lot more companies becoming B Corps, which just drew my attention to what it was, to try and understand where that intersection was between sort of the ESG side of things and business, particularly from a startup perspective when you're sort of hustling just to get things off the ground. So when I joined Forest and we started out, it felt important to me to have something to really point to beyond the fact, and it is a significant, the fact that we use renewable energy, but it felt like we needed to go sort of above and beyond that. And when I looked into B Corp and I explored it, I mean, it's set up in a way that is really favourable towards small businesses, because the fees you pay for it doesn't cost huge amounts because it's all relative to your revenue in the first place. So it works in favour of startups, but also it laid such a great foundation for a startup. I knew that if we could cover off all those 5 pillars of the B Corp credentials, we could have the foundations for a company that wasn't just succeeding in bringing bikes onto the roads, but actually in doing it well across the board, whether that be through governance, community, workers, and all the obviously environment and the riders as well. So I knew that if we used B Corp from the outset, we would have the foundations for a good company that we could sort of grow on from there.
Great. And I know that Forest is certified to ISO 9001, and you're currently looking to implement ISO 14001, I believe.
That's right, yeah. So as we grow and as we have grown, so we're currently in 18 boroughs in London, but we're growing geographically, which covers most of London. We're now spreading from sort of having one central hub to having several, so that we can sort of service the areas easily and access them easily. So that next ISO standard for us is going to be across all the warehouses, so that we can guarantee that they're all in line with environmental standards. And again, it's almost like what I said about the B Corp. It's laying the foundations for, right, as we grow from here, we've got the basic framework. We know we're doing things right. If we stick to that, it's sort of our guiding North Star, if you like.
Fantastic. And I know that B Corp, I guess, is similar in a way to ISO standards, in that it's all about continual improvement and progression. And I know that Forest have got a pretty high score for B Corp. Could you just explain, about the score, and what does that number actually represent in practice?
Okay, so there are the 5 pillars: community of B Corp: community, environment, governance, customers, and workers. So it's looking at sustainability and again, this is relatively similar to ISO, in a holistic way. It's not just saying, look, it's about carbon emissions, it's about reducing scope 1, scope 2, scope 3 emissions. It's actually looking at the supply chain. It's looking at how what we do interacts with all the stakeholders in the value chain, if you like, and so that's where you have to get certain marks and you have to get certain scores across the board. Typically, we and quite a lot of companies actually do relatively well in the environment section, because that is a very typical sort of sustainability place. Where they struggle more is actually probably around users, because that feedback can vary so much around net promoter scores and the like. But having that holistic view is really helpful to give companies, as I said, that framework for which to go on, and it to not be laser focused on, right, let's just reduce emissions, because often when you do that, it comes at a cost of something else. So if you're looking to sort of save money because you're trying to reduce emissions and you're spending more on more expensive or smaller supply chains, actually it does sometimes come at a cost, and you end up compensating on your labour force, which again isn't really a holistic view of sort of sustainability as a wider point.
Yeah, I think talking about, the broader aspects of sustainability, a lot of organisations are trying to retrofit sustainability into their business operations now, and trying to look at that retrospectively, which is obviously quite challenging. But at Forest, you embrace sustainability from the very beginning, from day one, rather than retrofitting at a later stage. So how did you go about embedding sustainability into business operations from the very beginning? Because I think this would be quite handy for startups listening to this.
Totally, yeah. No, I think yeah, it's a really interesting one. It was in our vision and our mission from the get-go. So our CEO and founder, he previously worked at a ride-hailing company called Cabify, and he led the Latin American operations there. And Cabify was the first mobility company to offset all its emissions. And so what that looks like is they did the classic, and this was back before 2020, so it was quite thought leading, really. They offset all their emissions, their scope 3 emissions, with a project in the Amazonas. And he was part of that. He was really inspired by that. And part of the idea behind what we were then called, which was Human Forest, was the idea that humans on bikes moving around the city can save CO2 from carbon emitting modes of transport. So it wasn't so much just about like, let's do this company and let's see if we can kind of make it sustainable. It was very much ingrained into the vision that he had for the company from the get-go, which made things a lot easier, because you just don't have that barrier to trying to unlock budget, for example, to get these things over the line. It was part of our brand and part of our USP, which made it much easier. Now, one interesting thing that you said, that it is hard to kind of retrofit onto bigger companies. And I think you're right, it is very hard, because we've baked in the price of renewable energy from the beginning. So we don't have to worry about that transition. But also sometimes another dynamic to that, big versus small company, and how they approach sustainability, is that we don't have, as a result of that, these very smooth, beautiful trajectories towards net zero at 2030 or 2050 or whenever you want to pitch it in the future, because we've always done it and because we're high growth. So there is a challenge for smaller companies in communicating that sustainability piece, when actually, as we buy more bikes, as we grow geographically, technically our carbon footprint increases quite a lot with scope 3 emissions, right, in the production, the manufacturing of the bikes. So it does become complicated. I would say it's been so good to implement it right from the get-go, because everyone's bought in internally, it's baked into the financial model. But there are challenges around communication, and relative to our competitors, we can look like our transition to net zero is much less linear. So that's one to think about as well when you're thinking around when to transition or when to integrate sustainability practices into the business.
I think, what you mentioned about, communication being key, and the fact that you're doing it from the very beginning is to make life a lot easier moving forward. You also mentioned that Forest is growing at scale. You mentioned earlier that across many boroughs across London. But I read that Forest is reducing its carbon footprint by 53% year on year, which is pretty phenomenal given the growth. How do you balance that growth with genuine environmental accountability?
Yeah, it's super challenging. So that 53% figure is a great one to pull out. I mean, what we did here was super creative, and this is one of the things I love about sustainability. It can get quite in the trenches and in the weeds with the regulation, with the standards, with the accounting. But actually, what it comes back to, for me anyway, is thinking about creative ways to do things slightly better. And perfection is the enemy of good with a lot of it. What we did with that 53% is a relatively one-off project, although we have subsequently been able to follow it up a little bit. But when we were looking to purchase new bikes to expand into these boroughs, instead of going straight to the manufacturer and saying, right, we need to order X thousand more bikes, we went to our market, to the shared e-bike market more broadly across Europe, and we said, we know which other operators have the same bike manufacturer as us, and asked if they had any spares. So basically we purchased second-hand e-bikes from the market. They were unused, so that in terms of risk brought down quite a lot of the risk, because obviously safety is sort of the paramount thing here, even above sustainability. So we bought second-hand unused assets from another operator, which massively lowered that scope 3 emissions section. Now you can't do that forever, because there just isn't the same market for it. But it was a really good way of showing actually you can do things slightly differently if you dare to take a bit of a risk. And within that risk, I mean, our bikes, as you probably know, are dark green. They were bright blue. And so it was thinking, right, how do we get these bright blue bikes and integrate them into a dark green brand? But it was worth it because it massively lowered our carbon footprint. And also it was sort of creative and sort of fun and definitely sector leading. So that was how that 53% came off. But looking forward, as I said, we can't do that forever. So we now need to think about how do we approach the manufacturer. So one thing we've done with them is they've transitioned to using solar energy for the production process. And now we're doing an LCA into that bike to see how much that sort of reduced down the carbon emissions in that scope 3 part.
So in terms of scope 3 emissions, obviously it's the biggest challenge for all organisations. But what does tackling scope 3 look like in urban mobility?
Yeah, I think it's probably similar to most companies. I mean, 90% for us, it's almost 100% comes in scope 3. What I've noticed recently is that where about 3 years ago, 90% of our emissions came from the production and the shipment of the bikes. It's actually now evolving slightly less. So like the bikes are becoming a smaller portion of that scope 3. And it's really tricky as you know, as the data becomes stronger, it's hard to see whether that marginal loss of the bikes in the overall scope 3 percentage is because of a growth in our scope 3 in other areas like services, technology, and the office spaces, or whether it's because the accuracy around those areas is growing, if that makes sense. So it's this sort of slight methodology issue. So I think now where we're getting to with scope 3 is accuracy is king. So how many of our suppliers can we get to complete questionnaires to get the number really precise, so that as we grow, we know really where it's coming from. I mean, you probably hear the words AI a lot on bandied around, but also on the podcast. But I do think now we're looking at technology and software and what impact that has on scope 3 is becoming a big topic. And I think people are sort of chasing their tails to sort of work that out. And that's where we are as well, really trying to think about that as well as think about the bikes themselves.
Mm-hmm. You're the only micromobility operator with Vera validation. Just sharing with our listeners what that involves, and why does third-party validation matter? Because we have covered verification to ISO 14064, but that's for organisations' greenhouse gas emissions. I was just wondering if you can expand on the third-party validation.
Yeah, so again, it was having a backup. So in my mind, when I joined, I thought, right, let's get B Corp, let's get ISO, and let's get one more. It's just another sort of backup to your points. And at the time, Vera was very much the leader in this space. They actually they dominate the market, as you probably know, in the carbon market, so offsetting basically. So we didn't want to go through the whole process with them because we've never wanted to sell offsets, if you like. It just doesn't really make sense for our business, and I think it all gets a bit confused. But really, it was just to have another layer of confirmation, and they're quite a thorough process. They've come under the spotlight for how closely they monitor the long-term effectiveness of carbon offsetting projects across the globe. But for us, it was just another backdrop. And I think they did a really thorough process in terms of coming to the warehouse and validating what they saw and authenticating it and giving reassurance to any users or investors that are particularly sustainability kind of considerate.
Okay. Okay, I'd like to jump back to governance actually, because obviously going back to B Corp, it's very much not just about, as you said, about carbon, and but it's much broader as far as the 5 pillars are concerned, and obviously those dovetail quite nicely into ESG. And particularly from a governance perspective. So how does sustainability, communications as well that you're involved with, and public policy intersect with your role, Laura?
I think so. We work across these 18 boroughs, and unlike every other major city in the world, we have to negotiate borough by borough. So most other cities will have one unitary body like TfL that the schemes come under. So this model that we're working in London, because we are only in London, is quite disparate. So one borough, Islington, might want one set of sort of rules, parking regulation. The City of London might want something completely different. So we have to engage every single one of them, but it also becomes quite competitive. So each borough can pick a different operator. So I think for sustainability, there's 2 parts to it in the overlap with regulation. One is that it gives us a sort of step above our peers in terms of winning some of these contracts. But the other one is that's probably a bit more interesting and like long term, is how much the boroughs in London more generally is trying to reduce emissions and reach net zero. So we tap into that sort of active travel space. So the sustainability and the regulation piece is quite well connected in that respect.
Okay, lovely, thank you. So I think just finally, I think I'd like to ask a question about, in terms of, if an organisation listening to this is interested in getting B Corp certified, what advice would you give them?
I think communication with B Corp itself is important. They've recently gone under a kind of review of their whole process and their platform, and that will really help improve the sort of process and how onerous it is. I found actually when we communicated, obviously you have to do a lot on the portal, but actually when we communicated with people at B Lab, it was helpful to give us bigger context to it and just to bring it to life a little bit. So I think I would recommend doing it if you can, as early as you can. As I said, it lays the foundations for like a really good, solid business. And I would also say kind of go beyond the portal, like start actually speaking to people there, having conversations with it, and you'll see what they're trying to get to, and you'll see where it fits within the bigger picture. And then after you've got certified, being part of that B Lab community is really great. It's really interesting. It connects your brand with other brands in a unique way. They had just on Tuesday, for example, a B Corp breakfast at Somerset House. You meet a lot more people, and that networking piece might be a little bit fluffy sometimes, but actually it's sort of the backdrop to a lot of the progress you see, not just internally, but within your company, which does tend to motivate people to keep wanting to work for companies that are interesting and sustainability driven.
Yes, yeah. And recently version 7 came out, didn't it? So B Corp are raising their standards yet again. I was just wondering if Forest have started making plans towards upgrading to version 7. Because I know that one of the requirements, for example, is verification, isn't it? Verification of an organisation's emissions and including products as well.
We only got the this recent re-authentication in December, so it's a bit early to start a new process. I would love to say we do. I think we need to focus on that ISO piece across the different warehouses first, and then when we need to, we'll of course be on it. I suspect we're a B Corp. We're going to stay B Corp for as long as we possibly can, so it's not something we're going to let slip, put it that way.
Okay, great. And then just finally, just looking ahead to the future, what role do you think sustainable transport should play in helping cities to meet their net zero targets?
I mean, it's massive. I think transport makes up about a third of UK emissions. If we can get more people onto bikes, more people moving in an active, sustainable way that doesn't pump loads of rubbish into the air in London, it's a huge opportunity. We have about an 11% modal shift. So what that means is when we ask our users, what would you otherwise have done in terms of transport if you didn't get on one of our bikes, 11% say that they would have gone in a car or a taxi. That's quite significant. So 11% is big, and that's only covering the shared bike market. That's not private bikes either. So cycling in general has a massive part to play. Then there's big pieces around getting the city to sort of suit cyclists, if you like. And that's when sort of lobby groups can come in and also start thinking like Paris did with Hidalgo, the mayor there. They started to make it much more cycle friendly, but that also meant getting vehicles off the road like HGVs. So that's a big thing as well. And retrofitting the city to be able to fit the number of bikes is an important one. So it's a big and a complicated topic. But if a third of our emissions come from transport, it is definitely a big one that we should be looking to remedy as quickly as possible.
Absolutely. Yeah, agreed. Okay, Laura, well, thank you very much. You've been a wonderful guest today. And if any of our listeners would like to find out more about Forest, then the details, the website will be in the show notes for anybody to find out a little bit more about the organisation and their journey. So, thank you so much, Laura. It's been
great. Thank you so much. It's been really, really enjoyable.
Thank you.
Looking to use ISO standards to drive better business practice? Contact us at blackmoresuk.com to access further information and book your free 15-minute call.